law, I began to think like, gosh, like renters have a lot more problems than what I've just been talking about. So what do you think is missing from this law? Is one, like, because that's the idea, like all the work that CO's been doing on affordable housing and like really talking about the affordable housing crisis in Chattanooga, you know, this is the opposite side of the coin. Like what happens once you get housing and it's bad, you know, or the rent keeps going up, or, you know, the landlord changes owners and the new landlord decides to hike your rent. The answer to the question, so a couple days ago we had the question about if the place you're renting has been bought by someone else and they want to raise your rent, they're only going to be subject to the terms of the lease that you signed. So they inherit the lease. If you had a 1-year lease that's up in August, but you know, a new owner got it in January and they want to raise rent, they have to honor that lease until August, but once that lease is up, they can raise it. Those month-to-month leases, like the more I'm learning about them, that they just seem incredibly predatory, which...
So should you request a year lease?
Yes. Well, okay, no, it depends on your situation, right? Just like all housing law depends. Like, for example, if you're in a place where you don't know if you're going to stay there for a year, if you sign up for a year lease, then you're obligated to pay rent for a year. And if you break it after 3 months, you know, you're liable for the next 9 months of rent, even if you're not living there. Like, the landlord has a duty to fill it with another tenant, the landlord has a duty to advertise it and try to find someone to rent it, but if they can't, you have to pay all that
Can you
stuff.
sublease it?
So the subleasing is something that would be covered by the contract. So if your landlord-tenant agreement has a no subleasing clause, then you wouldn't be able to.
When your lease expires and your landlord isn't new, like you don't have a written lease in place? Yeah, in place, thanks.
It's free for all.
It's free for all. Okay.
I faced the same challenges when I was trying to move to the place that we have now because, you know, I knew I was going to be leaving my apartment, so I'm like, I'm just going to get on this apartment hunting as soon as I can. And no one, like, between finding a place that wasn't rented and then saying, like, well, I'm going to move in a month, and no landlord's going to be like, oh, that's fine. Like, every landlord was like, well, when's as soon as you can move in? And you're like, well, you know, I don't want to break my current lease, like, because I'm a good tenant. Don't you want a good tenant? And yeah, it's a weird balancing act, and it's terrible. I agree. I wish there were better ways. But yeah, so we talked about federal, we talked about state. Local laws that specifically deals with housing code. So, you know, there are some other local laws around like slum clearance and things, but what we're going to do here is talk about Chattanooga code and the minimum standards that houses are supposed to be kept up with in Chattanooga. And this is, I just want people to kind of like work with this a little bit. What I did was I went through the Chattanooga code and I printed out, I had someone sort of help me. Thank you. So I did a little write-up of all of the basic things in Chattanooga code. Now, as we talked about before, minor repairs are not something that are going to get you out of a lease, and they're not really something that are going to help you very much. But where they do help you is if you have this list and you're going to rent a new apartment and you notice these violations, you can understand before you sign the lease that the landlord is required to provide these minimum standards. Now granted, they're minimum, but this would be something to keep with you in a walkthrough, and if you notice like, hey, you know, this room doesn't have a window that opens, you can request that the landlord fix it and bring the house up to code, and make sure you get that in writing when you move in. So, and the code's all available online. If you want to find this online, if you just type in like Chattanooga City Code, it'll send you to this Unicode website, which is new within the last year and is like the coolest thing in the world. Because they used to have all the Chattanooga Code in PDFs that you had to download individually, and then they were terrible. Like you couldn't even search them because they were like scanned 3 times. But now they have it all available through this nice little thing. So if you want like the actual pieces of it and the actual language, I've had little sites so you can look it up. Any city in the state of Tennessee with over 500,000 people in the 2000 census and a municipal form of government. There's one city in the state of Tennessee that has that, so it's Nashville. And if you're in Nashville as a landlord, you have to register. and they can't charge more than $10 for registering, and there's nothing in the code that actually mandates that a housing inspector goes out and inspects the property that's going up for rent. So that's something that, and when we talk about other places, that's something that exists in other places and doesn't exist in Tennessee except for this like little tiny thing in Nashville where they make you register as a landlord, but there's no guarantee that you're gonna get inspected.
But if you, as a tenant, if you go into A, electrical violations, there's fire violations, you can't get out this door, that sort of thing, you can talk to somebody.
Yeah, the problem is, well, and that, so, and it goes back into the 311, you can file all these things and start that process. At the end of that road, you're gonna have, you have the ability to break your lease at that point and leave without recourse. But you don't have the ability to go in at a set amount of rent and then force them to come bring the house up to code, unless you get all this in writing before you move in. Yeah.
Where the property got foreclosed on while I was renting in it. And I think that whoever takes over that property has an obligation to hold that lease, like they can't just put you on the street.
Absolutely.
But in my situation, I was offered about $2,000 to move out. So I'm pretty sure even
That's pretty typical.
that happened.
Yeah, whoever buys the property has to uphold the lease that you entered into until the end of it. Or they can try to negotiate something else with you.
What if it's month to month though, and there wasn't like a stated period of time?
Yep, that's the month to month, like,
So then how do they hold you, like how, I don't know.
month to month leases are terrible. Like,
Because like Crye bought out this one property I was living in and they were just like, I don't know, the lease that I had signed was month to month, so they were like, well, you can keep living here, but we're probably gonna raise your rent, like blah, blah, so I was like, felt like my hands were tied. I
yeah,
don't know.
so they would be, in a month to month lease, they only have to give you 30 days before they raise your rent. So if they say next month your rent's gonna be higher, they can do that. They can't, as one of Tiffany, like, the neighbor of her aunt found out yesterday. Like, it's a different situation if the landlord says, well, I meant to raise your rent in July, or in January, you now, $25 a month, you now owe me $75 because you haven't been paying, but I didn't tell you you didn't have to pay. Like, they have to give you a 30-day warning. And yeah, this woman actually also like backdated a letter that she sent. It was all very shady. Landlords do crazy things, but if you're in a month-to-month lease, you don't have any protections from the landlord raising your rent next month. That's one of the advantages of having a year-long lease, because you have the ability to guarantee your rent at a certain rate per year. Of course, the downside is you're locked in. But yeah, it's month-to-month leases. The more I learned about them, I was just like, this is terrible. Who would do this? I'm like, well, I get it, but you know, you just understand it.
Do they have to put rent increases in writing or no? Not necessarily.
Well, I mean, they have to, if it's a month-to-month lease, or if your lease is up and they want to increase your rent, yeah, I mean, your next lease should be in writing and then they'll have the increase in it, but they don't have to wait. And next year, it'll be $100 more, and no more than that. It's, yeah. I mean, if they do that, then they're gonna be held to it, but I don't think anyone's gonna do that. I pulled some other resources, and there were pretty good ideas. Like, when we're talking about minor repairs, we know that they're hard to get with landlords. And we talked about the building codes, and we talked about the promises and leases. Oh, we didn't actually talk about this. This is actually interesting. So if you're implied a promise in a lease agreement or an advertisement and they don't fulfill that, so they had the example in something I was reading yesterday, like someone moved into an apartment complex that had a picture of a tenant at an intercom system, and it made it look like the entire building had intercom. And that was an implied promise that then the landlord would have to honor later on. So if it looks like there's an intercom system in all of their advertisements and they advertise a certain way, if you go there and you're like, wait a second, like this is nothing like that glossy stock photo they did. They would be breaching their contract if they didn't provide it. So, you know, either they could provide it or you could sell it. Yeah, and the idea that I thought was pretty effective, like if you're appealing to your landlord in writing, so this would be an example of like the hand railing. Some things that you could say that might be effective in like speeding along the process is like, well, this is a small problem, but it could be a big problem. Like that's like something you could put in, like What happens if my family falls? There's a potential for injury. That's something that no landlord wants to incur liability because of a housing code violation. So that might be something to include in a letter that would give to the landlord. Security problem, like this is something that's, allowing infestation or is it creating liability around security. It affects other tenants or, I'm willing to fix it, but I'm afraid I'm gonna make the problem worse. Like no landlords, like these are not like legal requirements, but these are just kind of ideas around when you're discussing your issues with your landlord, some things that you might want to focus on that would trigger maybe more concern. Tenants and other places who have organized for power. So we've spent the last hour and 25 minutes talking about how the laws here are pretty basic and they don't really have any protections. There are places around the country that have tenants unions and organizations of tenants, tenants coalitions, tenants associations. They're called different things in different places. They're not super common and they're a pretty heavy load. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some things that other groups have been doing and what that looks like. So the biggest one that I found that has the best website, I recommend checking it out, it's really great. Tenantsunion.org is the tenant union of Washington State. So it's based in Seattle, as you would expect. It was founded in 1975 and was incorporated in 77. And in 1980, they passed a rent regulation. Okay, rent control. Does anyone know what that means?
I think so. Just keeps you running the same over a long period of time.
Yeah, so in some cities like New York and San Francisco and Seattle and other places with fast rising rents, similar to Chattanooga, in some places cities pass laws that say if you're living within a certain area that's a rent control zone or certain buildings are designated as rent controlled, that means the landlord they can't raise the rent above a certain amount every year. That is illegal in Tennessee. They made it illegal a couple years ago. It's part of state law, but no municipal government can pass a law that prohibits a landlord from raising rent any amount. So, but anyway, that was Tenants Union of Washington State. They got a rent control thing passed. Then we'll talk about all this legislation that they got passed, but it was, I don't know, it's an interesting organization, but there are other places that are facing this and the laws aren't always so bad. The San Francisco Tenants Union is another good example of an organization that's doing it right. And of course, it's exactly where you'd expect it to be. But they also got a rent control ordinance. And then a lot of the things that they got after the rent control ordinance was extending the rent control ordinance to more buildings, to limit owner move-in evictions, because what was happening was the owners would have a house and then they would claim that they were moving back in it, and then to evict the tenant, and then they would immediately move back out and then re-rent it at a higher rate. So they put some limits on that. They got some ability to stop capital improvement costs from being pushed on, so like they put in new cabinets, they couldn't raise your rent in that amount. Relocation, they upped those if they were able to relocate people. But it's just what they're doing right in San Francisco is they have this tenants' rights boot camp, which I thought was fascinating. They go around and they do a free workshop for renters, somewhat like this, only their workshop, I guess, is happier because they get to tell them all the rights they do have. But they're going neighborhood by neighborhood to empower renters and stand up to speculators and prevent displacement. There's one, but anyway, they have these all across. So the idea is that these things don't just happen naturally, like they happen because people together are fighting it in small ways. So even though rent control is illegal in Tennessee, which is how most of these tenants unions got started, there are other things, other laws that would apply in Tennessee that would potentially be better. So legislation, I guess. So I guess first I'll just, rent regulation, illegal, and that's the code. It's 35-102 if anyone's interested in seeing the latest Tennessee one. But beyond that, ideas that people have that I've just heard, energy efficiency standards, that's currently the law in Memphis. And I have the ordinance available here. This was, in the city of Memphis, they passed an ordinance that requires rented houses to meet a certain level of efficiency. So in the city of Chattanooga, you know, as someone who lives in Highland Park, like the houses are insulated like Swiss cheese. And in the winter, it's winter in the building, and in the summer, it's hot. But in Memphis, there are some standards for rented houses that improve energy efficiency. So it doesn't have the same effect as rent control, so it's not illegal in the state of Tennessee. So it's something that, you know, we could potentially have in Chattanooga. Landlord registration, like we had just talked about in Nashville, they have the piece in the state law that says landlords must register. That way, the city has a better idea. In the city, there's a public tracking system of if there's one landlord who has a bunch of housing violations and there's constantly complaints, that would then become public record. And it would be easier to track who the slumlords were and then pressure them into, you know, whatever needs to happen to make them no longer slumlords. So that's something that we could petition for. Landlord registration doesn't do rent control. It would be something that could happen in Chattanooga. Other ideas that exist in other places, it's some of the things that the tenants unions across the country have fought for, a just cause eviction. So this idea that at the end of your lease, you should be able to continue the lease. You know, they might be able to raise your rent, but you should be able to stay there if you want to without them evicting you. Because right now, at the end of your lease, if your landlord wants you out and they want someone else they know to move in, they can do that because your lease is up. But in other places, they say, well, if there haven't been any problems, if payments have been on time, if you know they agree to pay the rent that you set, which this would be a problem if you didn't have rent control, but it's an idea. Housing maintenance. This would be one where inspectors could go out. This is one where in Seattle they have it, so in certain parts of the city there's a housing maintenance statute that says anyone who is renting buildings in a certain designated area of the city is required to keep the building habitable, so you can't just let buildings go to ruin. So you wouldn't have like all those boarded up buildings in Avondale that, you know, whoever owns them doesn't think it's financially reasonable to keep them up and livable because there's such a shortage of housing in Seattle and, you know, growing that here. There's a rental home inspection program, which was the latest sort of big win that they got in Seattle. Now this would be something that would be, it would be challenging to get a law like this, but this is one where they actually go in and inspect the rental homes before they're rented. So in Chattanooga right now, you get to carry around the housing code and go through your house and say, this is a violation, I'd like you to fix all these things. But there, you know, that's not on the renter, that's up to a team of people who work for the city. So that's, I found that interesting. The 60-day notices, the rent increases right now, it's 30 days. So, you know, you can, you know, play with the time that they have to inform you of rent increases, even if you're on a month-to-month lease, so you can at least have 2 months to find a new place if they were going to increase it. I mean, there are things you can do to add some rights, but, you know, it wouldn't fix the entire problem, but it would go a long way to help. But yeah, so we're back here. So, like, what are your thoughts on this point? Like, because in thinking about this, you know, there are, how many people in Chattanooga right now? Do you know?
Between Missionary Ridge and North Chattanooga, it's more than half of people who live there. So, roughly half.
So does this information, is it helpful for people that live in housing, like say in housing developments, because there's a lot of those properties, it's just like.
Yeah, well, so I think, yeah, in the beginning, all of the laws that we've talked about in this apply to public housing and apply to Section 8, only in addition to those, you get additional rights to organize. So it's, I mean, you know, the challenge is enforcement and all of those minimum repairs, that, you know, that's always the problem. But yeah, you have all of the same rights in Section 8 and of public housing. Yeah, but the idea is, you know, Chattanooga's at a place, and like we're at sort of this crossroads as far as housing goes, that it's a little bit overwhelming to think about. And the people who care about renting are, and who might be a group of people who could change the situation in Chattanooga, like I'd say most of you are sitting here now. So something to think about, like a takeaway, is if you're interested in being part of this, you know, it's not a project for one person, like this is really going to take a coalition, like, you know, I've reached out to a couple people, but if this is something that you think is worth pursuing, I'd love to sit down and talk to you about what that looks like. And it doesn't have to be like an overnight, we suddenly have a giant functioning Seattle Tenants Union with 8 or 10 staff people. But, you know, it can be small things like advocacy. I was thinking, you know, traveling workshops or a mediation service that would be a step between just fighting with your landlord and going to the code enforcement, because code enforcement ultimately ends with you maybe not being there anymore. We could start creating a database of rental situations. Something that I was thinking is it would be interesting to have, you know, if someone was moving out of particularly bad places, if we could just start documenting what these apartments look like and start keeping a database of what the insides of apartments look like under some landlords. We can start taking pictures of what needs to be fixed and, you know, start talking to those landlords directly. I don't know, does anyone have any other ideas, or does this sound just overwhelmingly depressing?
Is an administration legal, like, can you just kind of begin one?
So it wouldn't be mandatory. I mean, because we could do like a best practices, like these are the good landlords, and then promote that. Like that's a really,
Stuff, landlord directory, right?
yeah, where they would agree to a mediation service too, where they could like involve licensed mediators or someone trained. Like that's a really, really good idea. And that wouldn't be illegal. It would be illegal to mandate it unless you have some, you know, a law passing it.
Right, but you voluntarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Totally. Like, I think that's a really good idea. If you want to start doing that, I'm on board.